Welcome to the Nayak Library's virtual program, Unpaving the Way, the How and Why of Pollinator Pathways. Our presenter is Dana Harkrider. Dana is a beekeeper in Nayak. She graduated from Cornell's Master Beekeeping program and is a partner in the beekeeping operation of Lomar Farms in Palisades, New York. She also assists clients in setting up their own apiaries. In 2019, she and Lorian Barlow founded the Nayak Pollinator Pathway with the goal of creating a stronger ecological gardening community. Please visit their wonderful website at nayakpollinatorpathway.org, and please also check out nayaklibrary.org for information on future programs. Okay, Dana.
Okay, all right, so hi everybody, I'm Dana Harkrider and I'm going to be talking tonight about pollinator pathways. So as an introduction, if my slides will advance, there we go. That is me on the left. I'm Dana, and that is my partner in crime in all things pathway, Lorian Barlow, on the right. I'm a consultant and a beekeeper. I keep bees willingly, believe it or not, and Lorian is a teacher and a filmmaker. We are both avid native plant gardeners, and we were introduced last year by Marcy Denker, who's the Nayak Sustainability Coordinator, because Lorian and I are both advocates for pollinators. And we quickly joined forces and created the Nayak Pollinator Pathway. So I'll talk more about our pathway in a bit, but first, just as a quick review from high school biology class, what are pollinators? So there are about 200,000 different species of pollinators throughout the world. The ones that we typically think of and notice in our gardens are butterflies, birds, and bees. There's lots of letter B alliteration in pollinator species, in case you hadn't noticed. But pollinators are really all kinds of other species. They're moths, bats, flies, beetles, ants, wasps, even some amphibians are pollinators. Really, any animal or insect that gets on a plant and moves that pollen around from plant to plant, that's a pollinator. And pollination, of course, is what enables plants to bear fruit and to set seed and to reproduce. So this presentation is called the How and Why of Pollinator Pathways. And to begin with, I'm going to explain the why. Why support pollinators? Why create pollinator pathways? And I'll show you why in a short series of pictures. Take a minute to imagine how the landscape here in the US looked about 400 years ago when the settlers first started arriving. I mean, if you really think about it, there was no development, no pollution, no overpopulation, no invasive species. I mean, keep that image in your head for as long as you can, because now we're going to fast forward a relatively short 400 years, and our landscape looks like this. And also like this, and even like this. And all of this change that we've brought upon the planet, it's resulted in a huge loss of biodiversity. Now, these are some scary statistics for you. Since 1950, our population has more than doubled. We've lost 90% of our indigenous continental forests. Urban development continues to claim 2 million acres every year. That's the size of Yellowstone National Park. That's what we're losing every year to development. And those last two statistics, of the lower 48 states, 54% are now cities and suburbs, 41% is agriculture. That means that 95% of the ecosystems that were here when the settlers got here have been totally disrupted. And if you lose 95% of the ecosystems, you stand to lose 95% of the species that depend upon those ecosystems. So we're seeing pollinator decline now on a massive scale. Now, this chart talks specifically about insect decline, but we're seeing these kinds of declines across all pollinator species. And what's really significant about this chart is that this is detailing declines that have occurred over the last decade. I mean, and look at this, we've lost about 40% of insects globally in just the past 10 years, with bees and butterflies that are among those the hardest hit. The UN also came out with a report about a year ago on world biodiversity, which also had a lot of scary statistics to report. But the main gist of it was that there are about 1 million animal and plant species that are currently facing extinction. And what's driving this collapse? What's causing all these species to be facing extinction? Well, like I talked about on an earlier slide, these are all human-driven changes. And in this graph, note that the land use patterns, like monoculture farming, urbanization, deforestation, wetlands interference, these things, they account for about 80% of the problem. Now, the silver lining of this is, if it's our land use that's driving the problem, then it's within our power to help by making different choices about how we use and manage land. And why does pollinator decline even matter? You know, what difference is it going to make if we lose some of these species? Well, most pollinators are insects, and everything in nature relies on insects. They are an essential part of the food web. Insects eat plants, myriads of other animals eat insects, spiders, reptiles, amphibians, rodents, bats. 96% of all terrestrial birds eat insects. And then larger animals, of course, eat those animals, and et cetera, it goes on. So if you take insects out of an ecosystem, it spells its doom. Insects as a group make up about 80% of all living species on the planet. They are truly the foundation of ecosystems. And then pollination, of course, is a crucial ecological service, not only for our agricultural crops. About 1/3 of the food on our table comes from plants that are pollinated by pollinators, but also for the vast majority of all flowering plants. I mean, about 90% of all plant species need pollinators to enable them to reproduce. And plants, as we know, they're the source of energy that support all life. They're what give us clean air and clean water and healthy topsoil, habitable land. You know, we as a human species, we will not survive the demise of the natural world. But here's the thing, there is no going back, right? I mean, there's no way that our landscape is ever going to look like it did in 1600 ever again. There's no reason to think that development or population growth or pollution, etc., are going to stop anytime soon. But like this great quote says, the task that faces us now is not to mourn what is lost, but to open our eyes and to see the spaces that surround us every day. Because the good news is, we already have the natural spaces that we can use to help keep all these pollinator species alive. It's our yards. It's green space around office buildings. It's public spaces like public parks. It's roadsides. You know, practically any green space can be converted to pollinator habitat. You can really get creative. Like this is called pollinator-friendly solar, and it's the practice of planting pollinator-friendly plants all around solar arrays. There's 6,000 acres of solar arrays that are currently being constructed in New York State. I mean, you can even convert an old raised train railway in a dense urban environment into pollinator habitat. And there is a literal garden revolution happening these days as we're realizing that if we're going to preserve our biodiversity, we've got to make space for these species within our 95%. We used to think, you know, oh, all these creatures will just go live in the wild, you know, but they can't anymore because there is literally hardly any truly wild space left. And the little bits that are left aren't nearly enough to support all these species. So if we want to help pollinators, we need to carve out habitat for them from our already developed spaces. But this means, in the great words of Doug Tallamy, who's an entomology professor at the University of Delaware, and he's the author of several amazing books and lots of different papers on this subject, it's now within the power of the gardener to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference. So that covers the why of pollinator pathways. And now we're going to get into the what and the how. So what is a pollinator pathway? Well, a pollinator pathway is a green corridor of public and private properties that provide native plant habitat and nutrition for pollinators. So pathways are designed to connect pollinator species in developed areas with the resources that they rely on to survive. Some pollinators have a really limited flight range. Okay, there are certain native bees whose range is only several hundred feet. Other pollinators migrate, like the monarch butterfly, over really long distances. And because of development and fragmentation of habitat, these species, they can't always get to the natural spaces that they need to find food or to lay their eggs or to complete their life cycles. So pathways that create a connect the dots landscape so that pollinators have more access to the resources that they need. Now, pollinator pathways can be literal straight lines, like the image on the left, where the residents of that particular street they work together to create a continuous stretch of pollinator-friendly plantings. Or they can look like the image on the right, where there's no literal straight line, but instead what you're looking to achieve is an overall increase in pollinator habitat throughout a particular area. Now, what we hope to achieve in Nayak will be like the image on the right. You know, everyone can participate in the pathway. Everyone in our community can be on the pathway and can be a part of this. Pollinator pathways are not a new concept, and as much as Lorian and I would like to take credit for it, we did not come up with this idea. Pollinator pathways are happening all over the world. This is just a brief list of a handful of various pathway initiatives happening worldwide. They go by different names, as you can see, you know, pollinator passage, butterfly highways, pollinator paths, bee lines, but the concept is the same. You're connecting pollinator species with the resources that they need to live. And one particular pollinator pathway initiative that I want to let you know about is happening right across the river from us. Over 85 towns throughout Westchester and southwestern Connecticut have created pollinator pathways in their communities with really great success. Now you can find out all about them on their website at pollinator-pathway.org. I've got it highlighted there on the slide. They have been a huge inspiration to us. We've gone to their meetings. They've been very generous with us with help and advice. Nayak is now listed as one of the towns on their site, and we are the first organized pathway across the river in Rockland County. But their site is extensive. It has so much great information. I really, really recommend checking them out. So some of the things that we've done already is the Nayak Pollinator Pathway. Last fall, we did a planting project of 4 different garden beds along Main Street in downtown Nayak. We worked with the village to come up with a native pollinator-friendly plant palette. We sourced all the plants. And then with the help of a really great group of volunteers, we filled these 4 beds with plants. These beds are now starting to come back to life after the winter, so keep an eye out for them as you're walking around Nayak. They're currently marked with the little green "Please Mind the Garden" signs that you can see in that bottom right slide. Also last fall, we planted a large garden bed right next to the Nayak Community Garden. We got a donation of plugs from a great organization in Westchester that makes native plant garden kits. They are called Plant Me a Rainbow. You can find them at plantmearainbow.com. And we planted this bed with the help of our volunteers, and this is going to be a whole chorus of beautiful pollinator-friendly plants. Definitely keep an eye out for this bed too. It is already coming to life after the winter, and it is just to the right of the gate leading into the community garden on the corner of Depew and Franklin. And this year we're working on a few different things. We've designed and just recently installed a pollinator garden for Marydell with Strawtown Studio. That's the picture there on the left. We've also joined the landscape committee for Riverhook, which is the picture on the bottom right. That's the old sheep farm property that the village of Upper Nayak recently purchased. And we were scheduled to speak at the Cornell Cooperative Extension Gardeners Day. That's their little image for the Gardeners Day. That was originally planned for April 1st, but it's now been postponed. Hopefully it will be sometime in June or July. But now we want to welcome our community residents to get on the pollinator pathway. So regardless of what kind of outdoor space you have, whether it's an expansive property or a small apartment balcony, just a few changes or additions to your green space can really, really help pollinators. And as private property owners or dwellers, we're really in a unique position because unlike with public land, we don't need to wait for a law to be passed or an initiative to be adopted. You know, we can go out tomorrow and create pollinator gardens on our properties. So the effects that we can make are much more immediate. So the absolute best thing that you can do to get on the Nayak pollinator pathway is to go native and plant native plants. So what is a native plant and why is it important to plant natives? Well, native plants are plants that evolved in a particular area. They originated in that particular part of the world. They were there before that ecosystem started to get disrupted. So for our area in general, that means plants that were here at least about 400 years ago before the settlers got here. Now, because native plants evolved in their areas over a long period of time, millennia, they're used to that area's weather, soil, rainfall, microclimate, you know, so once they're established, that means that they require far less care. And therefore, over time, they cost you far less money. So less work, less money, more self-sustaining plants. I mean, that sounds pretty great, right? Well, it is great, but that's actually not even the main reason to use native plants. The main reason is because of the ecological contributions that native plants make. These are the plants that our native wildlife eat. These are the plants that work with local ecosystems. Native ornamental plants contribute about 29 times more to ecosystems than do non-native ornamentals. For instance, this is a Kusa Dogwood tree. This is a non-native tree. It's from China. But regardless, it's planted prevalently throughout the US. There are a couple of these on my street alone. So a beautiful tree. This tree, though, supports no insect herbivores. There are no insects that can forage on this tree. Whereas this is our native flowering dogwood. This is a native tree. Also a beautiful tree. Now this tree supports 117 species of moths and butterflies alone. That's just moths and butterflies. That's not even taking into account all the other pollinator species that it supports. So the difference between native and non-native can be really, really significant. And the use of native plants in any kind of ecological restoration is important. And just a side note about native trees in particular. So first of all, if you're lucky enough to have any native trees on your property, especially native oaks, native cherries, or native willow trees, cherish those trees because the ecological contributions that native trees make are massive. I mean, for instance, southern live oak trees support 534 species of caterpillars alone. US native oak trees are so extremely important ecologically. When you chop down those trees, you are changing your area's entire ecosystem. Likewise, trees are a legacy planting. They are the single most ecologically effective thing you can plant. You know, I feel like discussions about pollinator gardens focus on perennial flowers, which are great. We definitely need more flowers. But for sheer volume of resources for pollinators, trees are where it's at. Trees contribute more to pollinators than anything else. So, you know, identify the trees on your property. Find out which ones you have and what they're contributing. Cherish your native trees and add more native trees to your property if you have the space. And this leads to the question of, well, what about non-natives? Do I need to get rid of any or all non-native species on my property? And the answer to that is no. I mean, there are non-native plants that do have some value for pollinators. Personally, I really like Nepeta. That's the bluish purple flowering plant in this photo. Its common name is catmint. It's a great plant. I mean, it's beautiful. My honeybees love it. It has a long bloom time. It attracts other pollinators. So even though it's not contributing ecologically on the same level as a native plant, it still has some value. And there are other non-native plants with the same qualities as catmint. But what you need to look at is sort of the overall scorecard of a plant. One of the other good qualities about catmint is that this is a plant that behaves well with other plants. It stays where it's planted. It doesn't crowd out other natives. It doesn't spread or change the soil quality so that other natives can't grow. It's a pretty well-behaved plant. So if you have non-native plants with these qualities, it's okay to keep them. Also, if you go through your property and you identify all the plants and trees that you have, it's extremely likely that you'll discover you've got a lot more non-natives than natives. Most of us do, and I'll explain why in a later slide. So it's just not practical or feasible or affordable to replace them all at once. So what you can do instead is, when your non-native species die off naturally, just replace them with natives, or add more native plants to your landscape wherever you can. But the one time that you really should make your best efforts to remove a non-native species is if it's an invasive species. Okay, so invasive plants. Invasive plants are not just plants with an aggressive growth habit. Invasive plants have a specific definition. They are non-native plants that are doing harm. Now, usually they're doing harm because they spread rapidly and then they outcompete and they kill all other plants in the landscape. Now, this is a picture of Japanese knotweed, which you're probably all familiar with because it's everywhere here in Rockland County. Invasives, I mean, if you're a gardener, you already know that the battle against invasives is relentless and continuous. You have to pick your battles. There are different recommended methods of removal for different types of invasives. But something to keep in mind is that in general, the best time to try to get rid of an invasive species is when you actually don't have a lot of it on your property. Because if you wait until it's really established, like the Japanese knotweed in this photo, where it's grown everywhere, this kind of invasion can be next to impossible to remove. Now, in addition to planting native plants and removing invasive plants, another thing to think about is habitat for pollinators. So pollinators need nesting sites and overwintering sites. As an example, native bees. So there are about 4,000 different species of bees just here in the US. The vast majority of them are solitary bees. And what this means is they don't live in large colonies like honeybees do. These bees have just one queen provisioning a nest for her young. And they're usually not perennial, meaning that individual bees don't live year after year. Some solitary bees, they emerge at one time of year, they mate, they provision a nest, lay eggs, then they die. And it's their young that emerge the following year. So these bees, they need safe spaces to create their nests and to lay their eggs, and then either to overwinter themselves or to overwinter their young. Lots of bees nest in the ground. So keeping some patches of bare soil on your property allows these bees the space to burrow. Some bees nest in wood, like carpenter bees. So leaving snags, which are dead trees, or tree stumps or tree branches in a pile are all good for these bees. And some bees lay their eggs in the hollow stems of plants. So as your perennials and your shrubs die off in the fall, don't cut them back in the fall. Leave them standing throughout the winter. Don't cut them back until the spring. And the seeds of some of those plants are food for birds too throughout the winter. Also, many pollinators overwinter underneath leaf litter. Leaves are essential winter shelter for hibernating bumblebee species and the larvae of numerous butterfly and moth species. So consider leaving your leaves in the fall. And what this means is don't blow them, don't bag them, just leave them. I know it sounds crazy, but a light layer of leaf litter will not kill your grass, and it will biodegrade over winter. And those leaves are also amazing fertilizer for your soil. Now, if you have a really thick layer of leaf litters, like several inches, that could kill your grass. So if you don't want that to happen, there's a couple of options. You can rake all those leaves into your garden beds. You know, leaves are nature's mulch. I use my fallen leaves as mulch for my garden beds throughout the entire year. Another option is you can rake them into a big pile on one part of your property if you have the space, and just allow them to compost. That's fine too. Or if you really need to get them off your grass, you can also mulch mow the leaves on your grass. You can set your lawnmowers to mulch, and that will mulch up the leaves right away. And when they're mulched, they break down, they biodegrade immediately. Leaving your leaves, though, it's not nearly as complicated as you might think, and I really encourage you to try it, even if you do it like incrementally. And imagine a world with less leaf blower noise. I mean, that's pretty nice, isn't it? And of course, if you want to help pollinators, don't use pesticides. Now, pesticides are an umbrella term that includes insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And I feel like this subject gets enough mention in the news, so I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but these chemicals are overused. Many of them persist in nature, and they have really hugely detrimental effects on pollinators. And sometimes they're combined effects, like when a bee comes in contact with a fungicide and then with an insecticide on a foraging trip, which can easily happen to a bee on a single foraging trip. Those two chemicals can combine together and become more toxic than either one of them is individually. They can be exponentially harmful to that bee. So just wherever possible, it's best to avoid chemical pesticides entirely. And the next thing to consider is limiting your lawn. There are over 40 million acres of lawn in the US. That's an area about the size of the state of Texas. And unfortunately, lawns can just be incredibly wasteful. You know, the amount of water and herbicides and fertilizers that are used on lawns, it's just astounding. And in addition to that, lawns really don't contribute anything ecologically. Also, you know, if we're looking for more potential habitat for pollinators, here's 40 million acres that could easily be converted. So, but I want to explain this a little bit further because, you know, lawns here are a really ingrained aesthetic, and a lot of people really like their lawns and aren't interested in losing them, or just getting rid of some of all your lawn can really seem daunting. So here's what you can do. You know, if you're using your lawn, if you have kids that are out playing soccer on your lawn every day, then by all means keep it. Just don't put herbicides or fertilizers on it. You know, let those dandelions bloom. And in our climate, we typically get plenty of rain, so you really don't need to water it. So no herbicides, no fertilizers, don't water it. But if you're open to making some small changes or even some large changes to your lawn, here's a couple of ways that you might do it. If you've got existing garden beds, maybe that are alongside your house, widen them. Expand them into your lawn, pull them out, take out a lot of turf, make those garden beds wider and fill them with more perennials and shrubs. Or maybe you've got an existing pathway, like this house has a brick pathway going up to their front door. Make garden beds along that pathway. You can see in both these photos, there's still lawn on these properties. You don't have to lose all of it, but you can just start to chip away at it. Another idea is you can create islands of perennials in the middle of your lawn, or at the corners, or at the edges. You can plant around downspouts. You can plant around mailboxes. You can plant around existing trees or shrubs. I mean, I tried to pick a few pictures here that show that you don't have to get rid of all your lawn if you don't want to. You know, if you do, fantastic, you certainly can. A meadowscape would be a lot more ecologically beneficial. But if you prefer sort of a more orderly aesthetic, you can still have that and provide more food and habitat for pollinators. The two are not mutually exclusive. And I've also been making a lot of references to like your property, you know, your house, your green space. But I want to bring up that it doesn't matter if you don't own your home, or if you don't have a yard, or if you don't have any green space at all. You know, maybe you just have a balcony or a deck. You know, maybe you just have a few window boxes. It doesn't make a difference. Plant some pots, and if you plant it, they will come. If you plant, pollinators will find you. And in a way, it's easier if you have a more limited space, because you're not dealing with plants that you inherited from a previous homeowner. And you've got a clean slate, and you can pick the exact pollinator-friendly plants that will work for your conditions. So to help you get started, these are a few online sources where you can search for combinations of native plants that might work for your yard. Pollinator Partnership, they're a pollinator advocacy group. They have some guides of different native plants that are really fantastic. They also have an app that you can download to your phone. The New York Division of Lands and Forests, they also have a great list of different natives that are you know, for our particular ecoregion. Pollinator-pathway.org, like I've talked about before, they have a garden design ebook on their website that I can't recommend enough. A landscape designer has put together several design templates for really typical suburban yard spaces. And she's got all the different plants. It's all sketched out. She lists different types of plants for different conditions, you know, sun, shade, wet, dry. It's really, really informative. Just a great book. Toadshade Wildflower Farm, they're a mail order plant nursery in New Jersey. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit more on an upcoming slide, but their website is also great to search through, because you can search not only by names of plants, but you can search like for plants that attract a certain type of pollinator. You know, maybe you want to attract a certain type of butterfly or hummingbirds. You can search by color. So that they're a great resource. And then of course, Xerces Society, they're also a pollinator advocacy group. They have some wonderful, wonderful plant lists. So this slide, this is not at all an exhaustive list of sources, but these are 5 good ones to help you get started. And now that we're able to get out and shop for plants again, let's talk about nurseries. So plant nurseries in general, especially the big box nurseries, they sell mostly about 80% non-native plants. And this is because years ago, when the nursery industry was getting started, nobody wanted to spend money on native plants, that it was still possible to just get a shovel and go dig up from the woods at the end of the road. I mean, nurseries made money selling exotic plants. Plants from other countries, plants that no one had ever seen before. The vast majority of invasive species that are here today were brought here on purpose by the horticultural industry. You know, invasive species are not invasive in their native regions. They evolved with the other native plants and animals in that region, and ecologically, those species keep each other's populations in check. So it just didn't occur to anyone in the horticultural industry years ago, when they were starting to bring these plants to different parts of the world, that if you take a species out of its native region, that it might become invasive somewhere else. But yeah, you know, that you take a species to a part of the world where it has no natural predators, sometimes it goes crazy and becomes invasive. So believe it or not, too, nurseries still sell invasive plants. So nurseries are going to have mostly non-natives and even some invasives. So you really have to be careful with what you buy. you've got to do a little research on the plants that you buy because plant choice matters. Now, in general, we recommend going to independent nurseries more than like big box nurseries, mostly because you're going to usually find more knowledgeable staff at an independent nursery. But if you want to find an all native plant selection, then you need to go to a native plant nursery. Now, these are 3 that we like that are within a drive of our area. I'm a big fan of Earth Tones. They are pretty wonderful. They do a lot of restoration work. They grow all their own plants from seed. Catskill Native Nursery up in the Catskills too is just a wonderful, wonderful place to visit. And I personally have not yet been to One Nature in Beacon, but I've heard really good things. And another source of great native plants is the Native Plant Center of Westchester Community College. They have 2 sales. Now, the Native Plant Center is an educational center. They give courses on native plants, but they have 2 sales throughout the year. Their spring sale this year, unfortunately, was canceled, but hopefully they will still have their fall sale in September, and that one they always have at Rosedale Nurseries in Hawthorne, New York. Usually they have lots of volunteers there, people giving talks. There's lots of people that can recommend native plants to you, if you're looking for plants for different conditions in your yard. So they are a really, really wonderful resource. And if you're interested in taking courses on native plants, they have a really amazing courses. So yeah, I highly, highly recommend checking them out. And these are some of our favorite local nurseries. I've highlighted Cottage Creek Gardens in Valley Cottage because they are near and dear to our hearts. If you haven't yet gone to see Jennifer and Duncan at Cottage Creek, run, don't walk. Jennifer runs their nursery from their home. She has a great selection of plants. She's got wonderful plant knowledge. Many of the plants that we used for our planting project last fall, we got from Jennifer. And she is open now during these times of COVID. She's doing plant delivery, driveway pickup, safely distanced browsing by appointment only. And Cletus Farms, they're another one of my favorites. They're family owned. They have a decent selection of natives. They have really good prices. And then Van Houten Farms is also one that I like. They're a local business. They grow a lot of their own plants. They have a really great selection overall, and their selection of native plants is improving. Also, in these times of COVID, fortunately, if you'd like, you can mail order your plants too. So these are 3 mail order nurseries that we like. Toadshade Wildflower Farm, like I've talked about before. The owner of that business, Randy Eckel, she's wonderful. She has amazing plant knowledge. So again, check out her website. And what's nice about ordering from Toadshade is they're not that far away, so your plants aren't going to be packed up in packaging for all that long. And then the Prairie Moon Nursery and Prairie Nursery, those are actually 2 separate nurseries, real similar names. They have great selections of natives, and you can get a lot of plugs from either of those nurseries. Definitely worth checking out. So now for the fun part of this presentation, let's talk about some of our favorite native plants. So, mountain mint. How do I love thee, let me count the ways. This is one of my absolute favorite plants, and the main reason that I really like this plant is because of when it blooms. We actually have a dearth of flowering plants in about midsummer here in the Hudson Valley. It's from about mid-July to late August. It's from when the clover stops blooming to when the goldenrod starts blooming. During that time of year, there's actually not a lot of stuff in bloom. So pollinators are really struggling to find enough pollen and nectar during this time. And it's an odd time to think about there not being a lot of stuff in bloom because it's midsummer. So I think as people, we're looking around going, oh, well, everything's green. Isn't there just tons of stuff blooming? Here in our area, there actually isn't. But this plant blooms continuously throughout that time. And when this is in bloom in my yard, it is covered in pollinators and they are just loving life. So it's a lot of fun to watch. Very deer resistant plant. My deer don't touch it. And it does get a little bit aggressive in full sun, so you want to give it some space, but if it's in a more of a sun shade combination, it won't grow as aggressively. And you are going to need to seek out this plant from a native plant nursery. You probably won't find it in a regular nursery. Nopi Weed, this is another favorite. This also blooms during the dearth of flowering plants in the Hudson Valley. Also very deer resistant. Gorgeous plant when it's in bloom. As you can see, it's got these big, beautiful pink blossoms. But even when it's not blooming, it has lovely foliage. It's really pretty to look at. This plant gets big. It can get tall. It has dwarf varieties that you can get, but even the dwarf ones get to be about 5 feet tall. So give this plant some space. You will be able to find this plant in regular nurseries these days, as well as native plant nurseries, of course. Milkweed. So for butterflies, what's important is not only nectar sources, but host plants. So butterflies need plants where they can lay their eggs, and those caterpillars can hatch, and the caterpillars can eat that plant. Milkweed is the host plant for the monarch butterfly. So if you're creating a pollinator garden, definitely include some milkweed. There's lots of different types, well, several different types of milkweed that you can choose from. You can find several of them at regular nurseries these days, because a lot of people are interested in planting milkweed with all the press that the plight of the monarch butterfly has gotten. These are very deer resistant plants. This particular milkweed in the photo is common milkweed. It gets very tall and those blossoms just smell amazing. So this is definitely one to include in any pollinator garden. Tick seed, this is a little personal favorite. So smaller plant, this is Coreopsis Tessalata in the picture. It grows to about, a foot, 18 inches tall. Small pollinators. I see a lot of like tiny native bees visiting this plant. Gorgeous yellow blossoms all throughout the summer and throughout the dearth. You want to plant this plant in drifts for sure. So don't plant just one, plant like 15. You can definitely find this plant, several different types of it, in regular nurseries, and then of course native plant nurseries. Aster. Aster is a extremely important late fall pollen source for pollinators. So lots of different types of aster to choose from. Aster is a common name for something like 600 different species. Not all of them are native, but several are. The ones that are native to our region are really gorgeous. This is also a must to include in your pollinator garden, because you want to think about planting plants that are going to bloom for 3 seasons, 3-season bloom, stuff that's going to be blooming in the spring, in the summer, and then as well as the fall. And certainly any plants that bloom in early spring when there's not so much coming up, or in late fall when a lot of things have already died, those are going to be pretty important. So aster is definitely one of those late fall choices. And you can definitely find asters in regular nurseries, not just native plant nurseries. Shrubby St. Johnswort, this is another personal favorite. Gorgeous little sort of small shrub, 3 to 4 feet. Lovely foliage, looks great when it's in bloom, looks great when it's not. In June, these gorgeous yellow flowers, and like in the picture, start coming out. My bumblebees go absolutely crazy for them. You're going to need to seek out this plant from a native plant nursery. You might be able to find a cultivar in a regular nursery, but for the straight species, you're definitely going to need to go to a native plant nursery. But this is a lovely, lovely shrub. Oh, and very deer resistant. Labrador Violets, these are a ground cover. They bloom in early spring. They've got that lovely dark foliage and these little purple flowers. They spread, and this is the host plant for the fritillary butterfly. definitely one though that you're going to have to seek out from a native plant nursery. And last but not least, Trumpet Honeysuckle. So gorgeous plant. This is our native honeysuckle. If you seek out honeysuckles, you're going to want to seek out this particular species, because most of the honeysuckles that are sold in regular nurseries are, for instance, Japanese honeysuckle, which is invasive. So take the time, find this particular species. It's gorgeous. As you can see, it's got those lovely like little ombre magenta to orange blossoms. It attracts hummingbirds. It definitely gets really thick and full and long. It wants full sun and it wants to climb. So definitely give it a trellis or something that it can climb on. But this is a really, really great plant. So if you'd like to get more involved with the Nayak pollinator pathway, here's some ways that you can do it. So like we've already talked about, start your garden. Now is a great time to get your garden started and to start planting. On our website, we have a habitat checklist that you can go through to kind of help you design your garden. And once you've installed it, let us know. We want to put up a pathway map on our website where we'll be able to add different properties to the map, like show the different green spaces throughout Nayak that are participating in the pollinator pathway. So get in touch with us so that we can add your property to the map. Another thing that you can do is you can volunteer with us. We need all kinds of different skills from our volunteers. So we do not just need volunteers for manual labor of planting gardens. So if you're not up for doing plantings, there are other ways that you can contribute. We've got a volunteer form on our website. So please fill it out. Let us know if you can help us grow this pathway. And another concept that we've come up with that we're really liking is pollinator block parties. So if you've got good relationships with some of your neighbors and maybe you'd like to all get together to plant some pollinator gardens across some of your properties, you can orchestrate a block party with our help. And one idea, which is what the before and after pictures here are showing, is you could plant the hell strips. And hell strips are the space between the sidewalk and the street. You could plant those along your adjoining properties. Now, we recognize that now, during the pandemic, this might not be the best time to have an event like this, but this is certainly something to start thinking about. Maybe it's something that we could organize for the fall, or you could start talking to us and we could brainstorm now or talk to your neighbors. So something to think about. And lastly, just connect with us. I mean, our goal is to build a fun and supportive community of gardeners. We want to engage with our neighbors. We want to brainstorm ideas for upcoming projects. We're a young group. We were planning on having our first community meeting sometime this spring, but we've had to delay that, but we will hopefully be having it as soon as conditions allow. And we are really looking forward to meeting all of you in person. So thanks very much. That is the how and why of pollinator pathways.